So, though in some ways that's an unnatural order for me, because I really do want to address some of Sherry's comments about why I'm sort of forestalling the actual conducting of inquiry. I really think that's sort of a big sort of meta-frame problem. But I'll put that to the side for a second, and maybe talk about that through, so Evan, you mentioned the ways in which you find Agamben productive, or sort of what you like about Agamben. And I guess, and this sort of fits the broader frame that Sherry's talking about in terms of, I don't really read Agamben as somebody who's doing inquiry in the honorific sense of that term that I would like to give it. Now, that doesn't mean that everybody who does philosophy has to do inquiry, though there is a kind of pragmatist bent in me, and I share with Sherry. That's the direction that we should tend to push ourselves if we want philosophy to get better, make a difference, etc. So, maybe one way to put the point about concept-heavy theory in contrast to a more sort of agile, moving, flexible practice of theory as the conduct of inquiries, in terms of a contrast between, say, Agamben and somebody like Ian Hacking. And I don't have a problem, and I'm not trying to argue that Agamben shouldn't do what he does, or that people shouldn't do what Agamben does. What rather I find problematic is, A, the co-optation of Foucault along more Agambenian lines than sort of Hacking-style lines. Hacking's a relatively well-known philosopher and a relatively well-celebrated philosopher, but I think he's nowhere near the kind of cultural status within academia, especially within the theory wings of academia that I hang out with, that I hang out in, as Agamben. And so it might just be that I'm kind of hanging out in the wrong circles, and I'm sort of carping at people who are hanging out over here, but really I should go hang out with these other people. That might be it.
That might go without saying. You should come play more often. But here you are.
So yeah, I guess what I find problematic is the way that Foucault's become, that he's gotten co-opted by a line of thought that naturally leads to somebody like Agamben. But really the broader worry is not a worry about Foucault. The worry is about what we can do when we're doing philosophy, which I take in a very broad sense of the term. And I worry that philosophy finds itself too much trying to play the kind of game that Agamben is trying to get us to play, and that we're not enough attending to the kind of what I would like to characterize as sort of nitty-gritty, rigorous, sort of detailed social scientific work that Hacking is a better representative of for Foucault. Now, that said, it's contestable whether or not Foucault is actually a rigorous social scientist, or whether or not Hacking is a rigorous social scientist. I think that's a contest that we need to fight. I think Foucault's bringing something to the social sciences beyond the kind of positivism, though interestingly he was happy to call himself a happy positivist, which I really liked about Foucault, because in the sort of theoretical tradition that I think we're both mostly reared within, positivism is just like a no, like you don't want to be that. So I sort of find emboldening Foucault's remark that he's a felicitous positivist, he said. And by that I just, I take Foucault to really just mean that, I go into the archives and I look for facts. And that's not an easy thing to do. And it's certainly not easy to assemble what turns out to be an infinitude of facts into a coherent historical narrative that also speaks to problems in the present, right? And it's a very different kind of work than at least the work I was trained in. We always say that, the work that we're trained in. I mean, I trained myself to do the kind of work that I've done as a philosopher, where there's really not that same sort of infinitude that you get when you're digging around in an archive or just sort of doing history broadly. I mean, sort of the permutations just sort of exponentially multiply much more quickly, I find, than they do in the context of, say, doing scholarship on somebody like Foucault. So really, what I'm sort of trying to push with this Agamben versus Hacking contrast is an attentiveness to the possibility for doing philosophy, for doing theory, by way of practices that look much more empirical. And I think I'm carping against a certain version of French theory that maybe doesn't quite have the same currency that it once had. generally, but also in your discipline. So you mentioned Latour, who, from what I understand, Latour is sort of gaining a lot of attention. I'd be happy to describe Latour as the world's most important philosopher today. That's kind of a joke, though, because nobody in philosophy actually bothers to read Latour or teach graduate courses on Latour, which is just bizarre to me.
You were citing Graham Harman there, right?
What's that?
You were citing Graham Harman, who
he said that Latour is the most important philosopher in the world?
That we have never been modern, and I think he's pretty purposely provocative, that we have never been modern as the most important philosophical work of the late 20th century.
Yeah. So, and in Harman's work on Latour, I think I have issues with some of Harman's work. It's much more speculative than I would read Latour. So what I like in Latour is the empirical Latour, right? He's doing ethnography, he's doing anthropology, and that sits well with the Foucault that I learned from reading people like Ian Hacking and Paul Rabineau, who, as people know, is an anthropologist, who actually goes out and does field work. So, as a philosopher who spends most of my time reading books and who was trained in a very speculative tradition, who trained myself in a very speculative tradition, I really appreciate that empirical counterweight that we get in somebody like Latour. And I was really glad you picked up from Latour as you were giving your remarks. I double-checked the bibliography, and I do not cite Latour at all in the book, but Latour is sort of running throughout for my purposes, and definitely purification is a word I stole from Latour. I didn't cite him because I don't think I can actually do justice to what's going on. We had never been modern in there, and it would have been much more confusing than I would have been able to handle.
It would have blown Sharyn's mind if you named one more philosopher.
So very briefly, because you have to go in 30 seconds, psychoanalysis. I see Freudo-Marxism as the sort of, actually the kind of arch paradigm of that sort of Agambennian line of critique. I want to sort of move past Freudo-Marxism. I don't think we need that anymore. Of course, I would have to give an argument for that. I'm just up here making assertions. But
you could give an argument.
I could give an argument, or I could just...
A whole chapter.
I could give an argument by authority, by referring to Deleuze
well,
and Foucault.
that would be very Freudo-Marxist of you, wouldn't it?
So as my fathers said,
Yes.
both of them. So there's a little quip. Deleuze and Foucault were talking about Freudo-Marxism at one point in the early 70s when they were still friends. And there's this famous line where Deleuze says to Foucault, I'll take care of Freud, you take care of Marx.
Take care
in the sense of, yeah. Well, I'll handle them, right? I'll handle the one, you handle the other. And again, that doesn't mean, my view is not, nobody should be a Freudo-Marxist. But what really worries me is the way in which the academic left has become so heavily enamored of a certain kind of Freudo-Marxism that continues to return every 10 years, and I don't think we're actually getting anywhere with it. And I think Foucault offers a powerful alternative to that. I think Freudo-Marxism certainly has its place, but I think sometimes the kind of micro-critical practices that Foucault and Deleuze, and I would argue Latour, open up, do things for us that grand theory and the sort of what Foucault calls that sort of singular gesture of great refusal, right? That's the impression I get from reading Zizek or Jameson or sort of certain contemporary versions of politicized Freudo-Marxism. Foucault's whole project, and I think Deleuze's whole project, and Latour's whole project, is designed as a counterweight to that. There's a singular point of revolt, right? And we as theorists, if we can just put our finger on this one thing and sort of focus attention there, that the whole edifice is going to collapse and we'll be liberated and emancipated. I think that's politically debilitating, at least in the context that we find, in many of the contexts we find ourselves in today. I do think there are political situations in which you need emancipation at a single point of pressure, but I don't think that characterizes anything like contemporary global capitalist patriarchal racism, colonialism, legacies of that, right? I mean, the whole sort of mix that we find ourselves in, which we have this joke in the academy now where we string all these isms behind one another. I mean, that shows that it's not one thing, right? And I don't really think it's one thing, so I'm sort of hesitating and even characterizing it. Rather, we need these kind of micro requirements. Okay, I've kept you for 2.5 minutes too long.
Thank you.
But thank you so much for your comments. So maybe now let me go back to the frame in terms of, so if I'm criticizing Agamben and Freudo-Marxists and French theorists for being too high theory and not doing inquiry in my sort of hacking Foucault Dewey sense, then it would be a real problem for me if I turned out to be more like the Freudo-Marxists or the Agambennians than like the Foucaultians.
Well, one person's meta critique is another person's more practical move. You know, that's one of the reasons why I didn't think I could draw a line and say, after second order critique, you're done. Don't waste your time anymore. But surely somewhere between third and fourth level, we just got to stop. But I don't know where.
I'm with you on that. I would actually redraw the orders. And I would say there's only first order and second order, and it's sort of a shifting thing.
Okay.
So philosophy itself is a first order practice, but we can sort of go second order on that first order practice.
Yes.
So I wouldn't go the third, fourth, fifth order, but that's being too abstract still.
Okay.
But so this, I mean, I wanted to respond to this because this is a worry that I have, and this is a worry that I've had in writing this book and in writing the previous book on pragmatism, where, you know, one of my main points seems to be, well, you know, we philosophers, I guess, you know, we should stop being so arch-theoretical and we should start doing inquiry, right? Now, in some ways, that's an argument that only needs to be made against or vis-a-vis philosophers or theorists, because people who are already doing inquiry don't need to be told to do it. So it seems like I'm engaged in a strange sort of thing where I'm beating other philosophers over the head with this baton of inquiry. And so what's that about? Like, what kind of practice is that? Like, why should I be, why engage in the practice of a prolonged beating of my fellow philosophers over the head with this injunction, rather than just attending to the injunction myself? So there's that's a problem.
It's because philosophers are fucking stubborn and really like sitting in their offices.
There's that. So there's...
Sorry, did you get that?
We're going to have to edit out minute 65. Just kidding. So this is a critique that Kevin Olson raised to me. There was actually a symposium on the book just published in Foucault Studies. I think it came out last week. And Kevin Olson's a political theorist at UC Irvine in the critical theory tradition. And he's actually doing genealogy in a way that Foucault obviously did, Ian Hacking does, people like Ladome and Warder, a number of people who I cite in the book. So Kevin's one of these people who's actually doing genealogy, political genealogy moreover. So he raised to me this criticism that, well, look, the book is great, it does a lot of valuable things, but isn't the best way to get clear on a methodology to actually be in the act of doing inquiry and sort of extract methodology from that. And in many ways, my impulse to that is to say, yes, that is the best way to sort of figure out methodology. But I don't actually want to be so quick and concede the point to Kevin, because I think there's an important, I mean, I mentioned professionalizing. I think there's an important difference that we should attend to in terms of the kinds of strictures and constraints that operate in different disciplines. So I think it's a lot easier for somebody like Kevin, who's a political theorist in a political science department, where most of his colleagues do things like number crunching, and if they're not, you know, quant social scientists, they're certainly doing empirical work, except for the 2 or 3 theory people in the department, right? So for Kevin to go empirical is just like, great, like that's going to work out really well. But as I think the 3 of us know well, that is severely disincentivized in philosophy. Both at the broader disciplinary level of the way the discipline is disciplined and the way the discipline pleases itself, but then also, I mean, there are sort of maybe more kind of humdrum quotidian concerns about something like getting tenure, right? So getting tenure on a book that is genealogical in the appropriate empirical sense, well, some people might say this is a work of history, but not a work of philosophy. So it doesn't qualify. But then, you know, I would hand the book to the historians, and they'd say, well, it's not quite history either, so it doesn't qualify. So there's, you know, in some ways that's kind of, you know, that's a very practical or pragmatic concern, or a set of practical or pragmatic constraints that really don't enter into the argument of the book, and I wouldn't want the argument of the book to hang on that. So, you know, one way that I think about it is that the book was valuable for me in getting clear on methodology when I found myself in a context where I really had to do good old-fashioned philosophy, or at least thought that I had to do good old-fashioned philosophy. And I mean, this is certainly something that bears on me in the context of work with other colleagues who are not yet tenured, who are sort of, like me, interested in doing genealogies, but then there's that professional worry, like, well, how do I get tenure, right? Or how do I get a job, right? If I'm publishing in venues that aren't recognizable philosophy venues. But now I have tenure, so I can go actually do the pragmatic work, and as you know, I'm starting to sort of make moves in that direction with the Info Politics project, which is a lot further along than it was last year, and I'm sort of telling Stephanie I'm spending a lot of time in the stacks. I'm looking for a good archival project. I'm doing work that if it's not empirical, at least it's quasi-empirical. I think it's good empirical work. I'm finding facts and constructing a narrative out of facts. And there's a lot more to say about that. That's what the book is about. But of course, the account in the book is going to have to change in light of the kind of work that I see myself as doing now. So that's not a full answer, but I think it's in part maybe an explanation. So
Sure.
That's not a rational justification, but a causal explanation of how I came there. And I certainly recognize that, and this is a worry that I really aired in the beginnings of the Pragmatism book. I'm not there doing cultural critical philosophy, but hesitantly I still think there's something useful in talking about what it looks like.
Yeah. Well, yeah, these biographical details, we can talk more about that after, but it is really a hard decision to know what battles to fight in and what context, absolutely. But I was just really sad that it turned out this book wasn't written for me, because I wanted it to be, I guess it turns out it's not all about me, which is,
Well, that's why the publisher made me erase the dedication to you. It's okay. And then there's Stephanie, you raised the question of normativity. I mean, I kind of want to throw things open, but let me just briefly say that I think that I'll just sort of make I'll throw a few things out that I won't defend, but maybe we can talk about them. I mean, that's certainly also a point of the book that has received a lot of criticism. So Kevin Olson has criticized me on that. Amy Allen, also in Foucault Studies, has written a very provocative criticism of what the book is trying to do there. Todd May in a review essay in History and Theory. So these are all philosophers that you know too, just to give you a sense of where I'm coming from in responding. So my claim is not that genealogy is, as it were, neutral or something, or that it's totally norm-free. But I do think there's value in conceptions of critical philosophy that doesn't proceed with, as it were, sort of a strong normative intent, or doesn't have high normative ambitions. Now that doesn't mean, my argument is certainly not that all good philosophy is norm-free or minimal about its normative commitments. That's not the claim. The claim is rather that I think actually in order to do good normative work, we have to give ourselves the freedom to step back from the normatively laden practices that we find ourselves in, even though we can never fully do that, because I'm not buying this some kind of weird fact-value dichotomy. I'm not a positivist in that bad sense of the term. I'm a happy positivist, right? So positivist who's laden with emotions
I
and
like
feelings.
that on the t-shirt. I love that. A felicitous positivist. I'll take that one.
Okay, I'll order you one. It's a good phrase. I like it. Where is that from? Do you remember? Stephanie?
Felicitous positivist?
No.
Yeah.
But you were,
It's archaeology of knowledge.
but I interrupted. You were saying that you want to be able to step out of the normative moment, even though you can't completely, but you want philosophers to be free
To step out of it, to undertake this diagnostic moment in Benhabib's sense, or just in the everyday sense of specifying the problems that we find ourselves in the midst of, without thinking that a good specification of a problem already includes a judgment about, or a normative determination of what to do about the problem. I think Foucault's really good at putting his finger on problems, not these sort of singular, single point of great refusal problems that one finds in Freudo-Marxist problematization, which the concern with those is that they make things look too easy, right? If the problem is just, well, there's this one thing called capitalism and we've got to dismantle that. Well, gee, then things look really easy. We'll just dismantle capitalism. But of course, capitalism is this heterogeneity. It's much more difficult to dismantle. And I think Foucault helps us recognize that complexity. And in part, recognizing that complexity hangs, at least sometimes, on not forcing oneself to both, at the same time, diagnose and resolve. Though I think, my ambition would be to be able to do both, but I don't think it's good to think of the two as occurring in the same moment. And maybe that's sort of, to me, one of the going forward, for me, one of the more interesting insights that I tried to articulate in the book, because that's in some ways an inheritance of thinking of philosophy as the sort of systematic or totalizing enterprise that we get from Hegel and the bad versions of Kant, i.e. Kant himself, right? I'm just reading Kant against himself. Actually, let's say Kant. That we've got to have, that everything has to be sort of systematic, has to be in order with itself, and there needs to sort of be some kind of total philosophical vision that draws out the implications of everything, right? So that a good diagnosis would already contain within it the seeds of its own solution or something. I don't really think that's the case, because I think problems get solved in practice, and theorists sort of come along belatedly and maybe piece things together, articulate concepts. So it's not meant to be anti-normative, and you didn't use the term anti-normative, you used non-normative.
No, so I think what I was wondering is rather, and I suspect that we're in agreement, and so part of it is just a question of framing. Mm-hmm. But I'm curious if you think rather than reading Foucault as trying to step out of that normative frame, that maybe, to borrow a term that you used describing his use of Kant, is a transformative renewal, or a redescription or a redefining of what counts as normativity in the first place.
I think so. Yeah, I think there's that, and I think the redescription involves this kind of two-part conception that I borrowed from Benavides, where normativity has both this kind of background problematization out of which norms emerge, and then the foreground reconstructions of redesigning norms. And then my view is that Foucault is just not as good at the redesigning part, though I think that, that depends on context. What are we talking about, actually? So I say Dewey's better at it. In the context of, say, sexual ethics, Dewey's way worse at it. I mean, Dewey's so puritanical, and I don't even know if the word sexuality appears in the complete works. I don't think Foucault's the answer, though. I think there are other theorists who are much better in that space than Foucault. But so, I mean, the main argument is that in a general sense, Foucault's stronger on this diagnostic stuff, and pragmatists, Habermas, etc., stronger on the reconstructive stuff. I don't know if that's quite getting to the transformative renewal, though. But I should, yeah, stop.
I was very impressed with not only Stephanie's sort of outline of what you were about, which you have not been challenged in any way, so I assume and I think the questions that were raised are also very interesting to me, and I'm a historian, so there's a certain sense in which all the issues you talk about, the business about theory versus experiment, or the business of normativity versus exceptionalism of some kind or another, or activity, or pragmatic interaction or intervention. I think that one of the things that I have not heard you talk about, or anybody else talk about so far, is the way in which Foucault in the world, in his lifetime, as both a writer and as an activist, was in fact in a very sort of extraordinarily advantageous situation. He was a French intellectual at the very top of the intellectual pyramid, who in fact, by virtue of that, had immediate access to men and women of power. In other words, he was in a situation where when he got stirred up about something, or an issue arose in the public domain, he could actually go to the Minister of Justice's office, Robert Badinter, and talk to him about the absolute necessity this time around of abolishing capital punishment. He, in fact, knew people in the government, he knew people in the bureaucracy who could actually tell him where the pressure points were that would allow him to engage in asylum reform or prison reform, all of which he did, or mobilize people for various foreign policy manifestations about foreign policy issues about which he was concerned. This was a guy who he was in a situation where he could actually do both the things that you're trying to talk about in a kind of a problematic way. Mm-hmm. To him, I don't think he saw those distinctions so clearly. He was asked questions constantly about those things, but he always denied that they were a problem for him. He said, I'm not a theorist, I'm an experimentalist, and I engage with whatever happens to be the problem at the time and bring to whatever intellectual resources to this problem, intellectual resources I can bring to bear. So there's something that's so sui generis about French intellectuals, particularly this generation. Of course, there were people who preceded him who did the same thing, Sartre and others.
Yes.
But so sui generis about it that it's, in a certain sense, you have to contextualize his whole theory, all his writings, and his own activity, his own sort of interventions in the political process, which were very pragmatic and which had actual consequences and actual outcomes that were useful. In a sort of, maybe not a utopian sense, I would say abolishing capital punishment in a country that had practiced it so remarkably for such a long period of time is a kind of utopian outcome, given the fact that the publicity polls were completely against it. I mean, I think that there are things that can be made to happen in that particular way.
Yeah.
So I mean, I'm just wondering what you think about putting that particular thing into the picture, that business about his being a French intellectual, something that we don't have.
And especially not now.
Especially not now.
Yeah.
Everybody's looking for cover.
I think that's, yeah, thank you. I mean, that's tremendously insightful. I think, I mean, that, the part of Foucault's biography that I'm best acquainted with respect to that is his work with the Prison Information Group, the GIP, which is, I mean, definitely something that a lot of contemporary Foucault scholars, especially junior scholars of my generation, that's something that we're attending to. So a number of the GIP writings and pamphlets and materials were finally published in French a few years ago. Those are being translated into English by Harry Zern, who's a graduate student at DePaul University. And there's, alongside of that project, a group of essays that are coming out in which some of us are engaging this material prior to it actually being published in English. And I think that material reveals a lot about the way in which Foucault saw the work of what he likes to call, so he didn't necessarily use a term like inquiry, he didn't use a term like theory, but the terms that he's tended to draw to are terms like philosophy, but especially thought, right? The work of thought. And I think that Foucault's involvement with the prison groups, and you know, just for a little context on that, the Prison Information Group was largely a group of leftist activists, many of whom were intellectuals, who saw themselves in a sort of helpmeet role vis-a-vis prisoners. They weren't proposing policies that would solve the prison problem. They really were a prison information group. So they would go provide questionnaires to prisoners and prisoners' families, and then they would publish the results of these questionnaires. So it was really just meant to disseminate information about, well, what's it really like? What are the conditions of the French prisons really like? So it wasn't this normative move of, oh, I'm Foucault, I'm the theorist, I have the answer. I'm going to tell us what to do about prisons, right? Which, you know, for as much as I respect her work, I think that's the kind of mode of engagement that we give somebody like Angela Davis, right? Here's what to do. We need to abolish the prisons. You know, in some ways, theoretically, I see the point of that argument, but from a pragmatic point of view, it's just a non-starter, right? And that's not going to go anywhere. So that's not a critique of Angela Davis's theory. That's a critique of the ways in which she's exercising her power as an influential kind of intellectual and academic that she is, by making speech acts that are going to be rather non-potent compared to what they might be. And so Foucault's an interesting contrast case where his speech acts, but in part because of much greater privilege, not only the French Academy, but Foucault's whiteness, maleness, I mean, sexuality sort of plays in that in a different direction than somebody like Angela Davis. That's worth taking into account. And I think that would make it really, fertile field of, fertile topic for inquiry. But the kinds of speech acts that he found himself engaging in, that's the kind of model that I think where we see philosophy or thought in his sense sort of making productive use of itself, because it's attentive to its context in exactly the ways that you're talking about. There's much more that one could say about that, but. Yeah,
I have a question which, this is just based on really an impression I have, so maybe unfounded, and maybe it could clarify your use of the word critique.
Mm-hmm.
But listening to all the talk about your book, and particularly Sherry's last talk, I got the impression that Foucault was much more neutral or even appreciative of modernity, as opposed to hostile to modernity. Now, is that a correct impression of your argument?
That's a correct impression of my controversial, intentionally provocative reading of Foucault. And that sort of goes against the grain of what Evan was talking about in terms of Foucault's reception by way of the theory establishment, which, I mean, there's an interesting sort of micro-history of academia, the sociology of academia to be told there in terms of at the same time that Foucault is being read alongside Derrida, as Derrida is invited to Hopkins and Yale in the 60s and early 70s, and Foucault sort of brought along with that. Foucault's also being read at the same time and being brought into North America by a much smaller number of historians and philosophers of science, so people like Ian Hacking, anthropologists of science like Paul Ravenel, though Ravenel was a little bit later. But that sort of history of science reception, which is where Foucault was located in the French Academy, at least initially, didn't get the same kind of uptake in the US. So the argument in the book is that has a lot more to do with the politics of the American Academy than it has to do with Foucault. And so the thought is that the politics of the Academy were now in a different situation politically, in some ways worse, in some ways better. So I'm trying to revisit Foucault in terms of the context that we find ourselves in now. So then with respect to Foucault's reputation as an arch critic of modernity, or somebody who tells us a really dark story about ourselves, I think there's a lot in Foucault that gives us pause over ourselves. I think there's a lot in Foucault that any serious reader would find disturbing. But I also think in Foucault there's this empirical specificity that once you sort of attend to it, you begin to see that something like modernity as an object of inquiry is just, it doesn't make sense. Foucault wasn't writing about modernity. He was writing about, I mean, he wrote about many different things. He was writing about sexuality, especially sexual identity in the context of a culture that's enamored of psychoanalysis. He's writing about prisons, criminology, penology, these kinds of things. He was writing, Foucault's kind of broadest book is probably Order of Things, where he almost writes about science writ large, but really he's writing about a sort of triad of sciences that shapes itself in different ways. And I'm sure somebody could sort of drag passages out of Foucault where he says something about modernity on the whole. I don't think that's the best intent of Foucault's project of critique. I think that's sort of Habermas's debate, that's Lyotard, that's something that in some ways you find in Derrida. And I think Foucault's a useful counterweight to that kind of thought. And that's why Foucault, for me, doesn't sit well with Agamben, because Agamben is just writing about modernity. In fact, he's not writing about modernity. Agamben's writing about the entire historical destiny of the West. I mean, talk about an inflated object of inquiry. Like, if we can't get our grips on modernity, how are we going to get our grip on the political historical destiny of the West, right? So we've always been biopolitical, Agamben says. I mean, it's so huge, so overinflated that I can't see a way of possibly being empirical.
Yeah.
Exactly. And even in a sort of broad, capacious Quinian sense of empirical, right, where we've got sort of where our units of empirical significance aren't single facts, but are sort of much broader, coherent theories, right, theoretical paradigms. So that's why my Foucault doesn't sit well with Agamben and does sit well with somebody like Latour, who's really doing micro-practice, right? The worry about the Latourian approach is that it has the potential to be depoliticizing. So I think one of the challenges for the Latourian today, or the Foucaultian today, or one challenge I see for myself, if I want to claim that I'm doing something like political genealogy, is how can we maintain the project of political critique without wedding that project to these objects of critique, these objects of inquiry that I'm claiming are overinflated. So for me, modernity is overinflated as an object of inquiry. So too is capitalism. I don't have any interest in criticizing capital. I think it's too big of a thing to get our hands around. I think there are certain practices that fit within the realm of what we call capitalism that we can get our hands on. I would say the same thing about neoliberalism, which is the sort of current term of the day for the thing that we don't like. I'm interested in a critique of financialization, of self-entrepreneurialization, of corporatization, of public-private partnership. Some of these things are going to turn out to be useful, some are going to turn out to be problematic, some are going to turn out to be bad. But once we start doing the inquiry, then we can figure that out. But I think the academic left, I worry that the academic left, that we're sort of selling ourselves short by insisting that we need a critique of the whole thing.
Yeah.
Or we don't have any critical potency at all. And that's, that's I think what's sort of fueling Angela Davis a little bit.
Well, that's interesting. I agree. And I kind of lived through the 70s, and so the way as I recall it, basically, well, I know in France, Foucault was a big deal before Derrida was a big deal, but in the U.S. it was sort of the reverse, at least in literary studies.
Yeah.
I mean, first it was Derrida. I mean, he was the big deal in the 70s. And then the problem with Derrida is you kept going to political dead ends. I mean, where are you going to go with undecidability? And so then at the point at which we wanted to go in a political direction, that's when Foucault became a big deal. So 70s was kind of Derrida, and then the 80s was Foucault, and then he became a bigger deal than Derrida. But that, I can sort of see how our field, literary, took in, and the business with history of science and all the rest of it, I mean, I never heard of it. I was sort of oblivious to that side of it. But yeah, I think you're right. So that's interesting. But then at the end, you're saying, how can you still connect to the political? You can sell yourself to the point at which you'll lose contact with it. So.
Colin, actually, I don't mean to interrupt, but I wanted to make sure I thought I saw a question in the back, and I wanted to.
Well, I have a quick question, and it may be about for Stephanie, maybe for you, but I was very struck by the inclusion of Linda Alcott's challenge.
Yeah.
It's kind of the thing thrown down because Foucault was so productively taken up by many feminist critics sort of at the same time. Does your book speculate about, either in terms of the sociology of the academy, about why Alcoff, would have really dug so deeply into that dark doom version of Foucault when so many people all around her were not?
When was that quote from? Was that?
It's on postmodern.
I think it was. I'd have to check my bibliography, but I think it's from the 90s. It's fairly early. So I'm actually very sympathetic to that reading of Foucault, right? Whether it's Alcoff or others, and that part of it is Foucault wrote so much, and also the process by which his work got translated into English, that it's very, it's not surprising that people got hung up on his work on power and the aspects that were characterized as depressing, right? And so
Deterministic.
Yeah. As I was listening to Colin respond to Sharyn's comments, one of the things that's processing through my mind is sort of the problem of audience and why we have to spend so much time with Foucault's work before we can make sense of the aspects of his work that we find transformative. And so, as someone who works on Foucault and hopes to utilize his work for a project on disability ethics, or even in the context of Colin's work and the problem of impatience, but also outlining the struggles at hand before he can move on to a more empirical or practical project. I guess the question running through my mind is why is it that I feel the need to continually recommend Foucault to people who are working on these projects when so much work is involved before we can do things with it? And I'm not sure I have an answer to that right now, other than that there's something that really drew me to his work that continues to be there, right? A deep care and anxiety about the world, and that his work of the present is for the future. So,
as you're saying that, I'm thinking, I stopped recommending Rorty to people for the same reason, because you had to specify what way to read Rorty that would get you to this transformative place. He's the only philosopher who's written a book called Social Hope that has like hope in the title, that has there's so many exciting things you can do with him, but only under very specific readings that require a ton of argument to get going.
So I think part of, I guess another answer to that is something that Colin mentions, I forget where in the book, but he points out that a lot of the power of Foucault's work, a lot of what's unique about his work, it's hard for us to understand its significance because it's so familiar to us now, right? A lot of the hard work that he did in laying out his diagnostic methods, right? It was new then, right? It may be more commonplace for us, and so part of the explanation that we have to give for why he spends so much time doing this really dry, rigorous, mole-like archive work is because that's what was needed at the time, and so because that's the debate that we have in sort of the philosophical profession, there's a lot of sort of potential critics that need to be addressed before one can move forward into the project like what Colin's working on now.
Yeah, it makes sense that you're talking about audiences.
Yeah, but so I understand why people find Foucault deterministic, right, in that sort of way, because everyone's engaged in their own struggles and projects, and not all of us have time nor want to immerse ourselves in everything Foucault's ever written. But for those of us that his work speaks to, right, we find this transformative potential within it, and that's what I valued with Colin's work.
I just want to say I resonated with what you just said, your frustration at feeling like you have to accommodate or justify or deal with everything that other people think before you can use Foucault as a tool for what you want to do as a lens, as a entree into the disabilities work. I'm a historian of rhetoric and literacy, and Foucault in 18th century, and very useful to me to use Foucault theoretically, but in my book, when I first started sending it out, and there was a tiny section, a page maybe, where I was positioning my approach theoretically, and I mentioned Foucault along with some other people, and it's all they could see. It was like, she doesn't understand Foucault. My Foucault does this, or my Foucault does this other thing. And I finally, it was dominating the way, it was like, oh, here's something that I think is wrong, and then I'm not going to read what she's actually saying or doing. And so I really, and it was because here's my theory, everybody has their own Foucault. And that's
their own everybody.
Yeah, exactly.
There's some people that seem to have, more people have their own Rorty and Foucault than have their own, I don't know.
Kant.
Yeah, Kant, oh God, yeah.
Freudo-Marxism.
Yeah. Yeah. So anyway, I'm with you, and I think it's not an unfounded concern, but at a certain point you just have to do what you want to do, and get what you can out of it and use it.
Reviewers.
What?
Hope you get the right reviewers.
Hope you get the right reviewers, and then you move him to a footnote.
I have this vision in my mind of a choose your own adventure philosophy book, right? Like where you outline your project, and then if you're concerned about Foucault's uptake of Kant, read chapter 2.
Yeah.
If you are concerned about his reading of Habermas, read chapter 4, right? Or you can skip this section if you're not concerned about this problem, and maybe that's how we help impatient readers who want to get to the practice, like Sherry very quickly. You don't need to read this part. Go here, and also, we might be able to learn something from Foucault. And he says he doesn't want to engage in polemics, and his very powerful critique of philosophical figures like Marx, doesn't come out as an argument against Marx. It comes out in methods and practices and that are indirect. And maybe this is us learning in the Foucaultian context what he learned, right, in a Marxian context, is that, right, an argument against Marx will draw in the troops, right? But by performing the criticism differently, you get different results.
Cool. I think that so that goes a little bit to the question that you asked. To Stephanie's response, I would just add that. Strictly speaking, I agree with Alcoff's criticism, but only according to the exact letter in which she framed it. So I think the quote you had at the bottom was that Foucault is not useful for, and I think I'm quoting her at this point, but we can check your slide, an emancipatory feminist theory. And I think that's true, but only because Foucault was not interested in emancipation. But that's not to say that he was anti-emancipation. So in terms of the sort of Freudo-Marxist thing and Foucault doing something different, I don't think Foucault ever wanted to make an argument that nobody should try to liberate themselves or nobody should try to emancipate themselves. His argument was rather along the lines of, isn't it interesting how caught up we are, we being the new social movements of the 70s, right? Because definitely thinking of sexual politics at the time, how caught up those politics are in the rhetoric of liberation and emancipation, when it might not be the right kind of discursive, tactical, strategic frame for that political problem. That's not to say that there aren't people who are oppressed, right, boots on the neck right now, who need emancipation. I think that he would agree that there is. I mean, there is today, even if he would agree with it.
It's very suspicious of collective emancipation, or the notion that somehow a collectivity could actually achieve a kind of emancipation that actually in the end is an individual process and can only be done on the basis on an individual level.
Yeah, and Alcoff was certainly interested in that affiliative. I mean, her sort of emancipatory solution was all about affiliation and collectivization, so maybe that makes sense.
And I think so the sort of more Butlerian feminism that comes out of Foucault, which, I mean, I'm sort of much more in the book indebted to somebody like Amy Allen's feminist uses of Foucault, where, and I mention that because I have misgivings about the way that Butler's work has drifted more and more into psychoanalysis recently, and further from Foucault. But so Amy's work does a really great job of bringing Foucault and Habermas into conversation with one another for a kind of feminist politics that is not strictly or necessarily emancipatory in intent. Though it need not entail an argument against emancipation. It's just sometimes political transformation requires a non-emancipatory move.
Yeah.
Sorry.
So no, I just want to say, people are leaving.
Yeah.
But did you meet Bob Nye?
Yeah, he did.
Oh, good. Okay.
Thank you, Bob.
Yay!
Yeah, great
It's so
to
great
meet
to
you.
see
Take care.
you, and I will drop you an email about the
sure.
secret.
Thanks a lot.
And
Yeah,
it's so great to see the English
Great.
professors here.
We need more
Yay!
people from U of O up there, right?
We've been talking about this.
Thank you.
So, yeah,
Thank you.
Thank you.
Thank you everyone for coming, especially Colin.